the pipe pledge, and where previously, I guess our growing up, we could end with the E, which is the emotional quotient. Now, do you suggest we begin with that E? Should we rearrange this and make a word that makes no sense?
You actually have to. Nowadays, it doesn't mean anything to them. The more that I'm around these young kids, the more that I realize it's they've literally turned everything back in on themselves. Where if you ask somebody to do something, especially if it's difficult, back in the day, you could coach a kid to say, hey, this is going to help the team. Hey, this is going to help your fellow linebackers. Hey, this is going to help you guys when you are playing man defense on the basketball court. Nowadays, and it sounds terrible, but you have to play the hand that's dealt. You have to take a kid and go, if you're asking a kid to do dead bugs and it feels absolutely terrible and his ego is struggling because he can't do something, and that's a huge thing for these young kids. They're struggling and nobody wants to look stupid. Social media has now put at the forefront that everybody wants to look glorious. And so the moment that a kid doesn't feel like they're excelling, then they potentially can shut the door. And so now at that point in time, we used to be able to say, hey, don't quit for your other teammates. Don't quit on this, don't quit on that. But nowadays, the young kids wanting to go, hey, how does this help me? They all point back to themselves. And probably 10 years ago, that was a very jagged pill for me to swallow. It was like, well, screw you little punks. This isn't about you. This is about the team. But then the more you do it, you realize you're shutting the door on these kids, and I could win the battle and I can make them do a set of dead bugs and be absolutely miserable for a day or season or whatever you have it, but I'll lose the war. Mm-hmm. And that's the issue, that we may not like the landscape that we're in, but we have to learn how to navigate it. So when I look at that pipeline, I truly started to go, let's not look at these in order. Let's look at this as a dancing Venn diagram. So you've got that PIPE, and they are moving all over the place. And that E is a big target. If you can hit that E, you have a really good chance to develop a stronger relationship with that athlete.
And for our listeners, let's take a moment to walk through the pipe. What is our first P, the I, the second P, and then we've introduced the E?
So our PIPE started out with how we develop the athletes. And the first one was presence. It was what you are, God bless, talented with, how tall you are, how big you were. You looked at little things like just basic things that you really didn't have much control over. Your genetics, how you were built, even to the point where we pushed it into most times we are the product of our environment. You really don't have a say-so in there to a point. So if your parents are not really big into exercise and they don't push that, then you have a tendency to not value exercise. And so that is part of your presence, versus if you are Raider and you have to live with Raph and Steph, then you are forced into a world that really is surrounding you with some pretty amazing people. And that's the only world you know. So Raider doesn't know anything but that. And that's not his fault. It's just the luck of the draw. He was just kind of born into that world. The I is intelligence in terms of IQ. And so we try to let athletes know off of our experiences that if you develop bigger, faster, and stronger, but up here you weren't intelligent enough to play the game, then you were always just going to be a weight room champion, and you were never really going to take that into the arena. The next portion was our professionalism, and that's truly what we felt the next two separate a lot of people, and that's your ability to develop your craft. You start to look into some of the things like, yes, I'm fast, do I have it in me to develop faster? I might be fast, but I'm not flexible. Do I have it in me to swallow that jagged pill and say, you know what, I suck at flexibility. I really need to focus in on that and make sure that my weak link is no longer a weak link. And that's a very difficult thing. What we find in this day and age of in the new coaching landscape. And then that brings us to the final, and that's your EQ, and that's your emotional quotient. And that's something that years ago we looked at, and we figured out that what we did in the arena was just a product of our behaviors, our habits. And oftentimes I fell short as a coach when I would yell at somebody for displaying something that I knew was their habit. And that was an eye opener for me to sit there and say, okay, I need to change this, because I can't yell at them for doing something that I knew they were going to do, versus being proactive in it and saying, okay, this is where they are and this is where we want them to be. How can I make those adjustments to eventually get to a point where they're, and I know it sounds terrible, but that positive manipulation of behavior of saying, hey, you overreact when something doesn't go your way. Let's work on some things that help you not to overreact, so that you can keep your head in the game, so that when there's a bad call on the field, now all of a sudden you're not blowing up, you're not getting ejected, and now we can't play you in the national championship game, so to speak.
And with that blowing up, let's stick with emotional. And I know coaches are tempted to match that reaction and then almost blow it up and have that kid put their head down.
I'm going back, I'm a loaded freight train, and I'm right on track.